Good morning. Antonio, thank you for doing this. I think I speak for all of us that Antonio has been one of the great champions of the Santa Rita Hills from a very, very early start. And in terms of the wine industry, Santa Rita Hills is still very youthful. Sanford and Benedict was planted, I always get this wrong. Was it 1971? Was it 1972? Was it 1973?
It gets older as we get older. 1971.
1971, and Trey and John are so fortunate to be able to work with that vineyard, it being really the creation of the Santa Rita Hills in many ways. Domaine of Côte would not be here today without Sanford and Benedict. When I went to plant the vineyard in 2007, there was kind of a general conception in the United States that terroir doesn't exist in California, at least not in the way we refer to terroir in Burgundy. And my business partner, Rajat, was probably one of the most prominent sommeliers and authorities on Burgundy. And he and I both believed that it was important to join others in this crusade to prove that California had terroir. And so he and I both firmly believed that the Santa Rita Hills would be the best place to do that. I think this is an interesting panel because the wines come from different vineyards, and something that's important to understand about the Santa Rita Hills is that the western area of the Santa Rita Hills and the eastern area are very, very different. During the growing season, every mile you go east, you gain 1 degree of Fahrenheit. So if your vineyards are 15 miles apart, that's 15 degrees during the growing season. Doesn't sound like a lot, but when you add up the 100 days between mid-bloom and harvest, that's a lot of degree days. And that means that you make very different kinds of wines. And so there's both this influence of the soil and the influence of the climate. The two wines that I brought are maybe an extreme example of the fact that there's terroir in the Santa Rita Hills. The wines actually come from the same vineyard. So there's the Côte, which is a 4.5 acre, 5 acre vineyard. And Sous Chene is a microludi. It's a section inside of Côte. What really is remarkable about that wine for us is that it's called Sous Chene because the vines grow underneath this giant Pacific oak tree that's been there for hundreds of years. And that tree has influenced the microclimate and the terroir that those vines exist in. And so when you taste these two wines, they're picked virtually the same day. They are fermented exactly the same way. They are aged in exactly the same barrels, and they're bottled exactly on the same day. So the only difference that you're tasting is just that tiny difference that tree makes in that vineyard. And to me, it's just fascinating. And this is maybe not typically what we think of as an ingredient to terroir, because it's a living organism, not a stone or a climatic condition. But I think that what's important to understand about terroir is that in order to have that, you have to have transparency. And transparency only exists when you have a climate like we have in the Santa Rita Hills. It slows down the growing, it slows down the ripening. And so you get wines that are much more gentle and elegant, and when they are that way, you can have more transparency to the precise growing conditions that those vines exist in. And so that is what makes, for us, the Santa Rita Hills super exciting, because you can have this conversation about terroir, and you can make wines that are distinctive even when they come from the exact same place, but have just one minor difference.
Cool. So Côte is the much bigger bottling though, right?
So Côte normally now is something like 400 cases.
Okay, and Sous Chene?
Is usually 100.
Because some of Sous Chene goes into Côte as well, right?
That's right. So we always take, Côte wouldn't be Côte without Sous Chene, so we commit half of the production of Sous Chene into the Côte bottling because it's the same vineyard, and then half is bottled on its own just because it's so interesting.
Yeah, so I mean, you're talking about two wines, like one is produced within the larger vineyard and how different they are. And I think it's really cool. And in this vintage, the 21 vintage, which is a cooler vintage, that's probably further accentuated than it might be in a warmer year.
particularly at this time in the wine's life. So 21 for us was a fantastic vintage because the wines were showing so much character so early. Normally you'd have to wait a little bit longer, but yeah, 21 was a beautiful vintage for that.
And so there's another very big difference between the first two wines and the second two wines. So in Sanford and Benedict, Rinconada area, if you look at that map, you'll see it's sort of very centrally located vineyard. Probably that mix of sort of being in the middle creates a really complete wine. These three wines that we're tasting now are in the far west, but you also do a very high amount of whole clusters.
Yeah, so both wines are made with 100% whole bunches.
Which is where you do not, correct?
That's right. We're usually about 25 to 30%.
Yeah.
That was just Domaine de la Côte is kind of a it's an homage to classical Burgundy. So Raj and I, we drink a lot of wine, too much wine probably, and consistently our favorite wines from Burgundy were always wines that were made with lots of whole cluster, usually a lot of new oak, and from the cooler vintages. That's something that Raj and I really gravitated towards. And so Domaine de la Côte is really an homage to classical wines, that style of Pinot Noir, but from cooler vintages. Because in cooler vintages, you make wines that are just more silky and more elegant. Maybe not the most concentrated, most powerful wine, but for us, the most beguiling wine.
What wines do winemakers drink? Because those are their influences, and everybody has influences in whatever you do. I mean, if you're a musician, you've got influences. If you're an artist, you have influences. And if you're a winemaker, what you taste and what you cull from those experiences is absolutely fundamental. So I think it's really, next time you go to a winery, ask to see the owner or the winemaker's cellar. That'll tell you a lot about the way they think of wine before you taste anything, in my opinion.
Yeah, we get accused of trying to make Burgundy in California, and that's certainly not what we're doing. We're trying to make a very unique wine that is tied to its place. But of course, Burgundy is our North Star. I mean, it's 2,000 years of people trying to make something beautiful. Can't be discounted. So we're always using Burgundy as a reference point, particularly the way they think about wine. I think it's something that winemakers sometimes maybe don't spend enough time doing, which is to actually conceptualize the wine that they want to make before they actually even go to plant a vineyard. Oftentimes, I feel like winemaking, when I talk to other winemakers, is very reactive. They're reacting to everything instead of having a vision and doing everything towards that vision, even if it doesn't work at first.
But your approach has also changed over time, because when I first started tasting your wines, you liked a longer over vintage, what most people would call the classic Burgundian élevage for Grand Crus, which is bottling after 2 winters. Now you bottle like at 11 months.
Right.
So while you may have an influence in Burgundy, it's not a slavish following of protocol.
No. It was that was a product of understanding that if we wanted the wines to, he's no longer with us. Jim Clendenin was also an amazing advocate for our region. And one of Jim's greatest tools in the marketplace was sharing his older vintages. Because it really shows the strength of an appellation when you can taste a 20-year-old wine and it's still fresh and vibrant and complex. And so we moved to the earlier bottling because we're trying to get the wines to have every opportunity to be a 10, 20-year-old wine.
Okay, so the question is for Sashi, how did you decide that you wanted to make a Sous Chene bottling, and what's the influence of the tree itself to the wine?
So there was kind of started making wine in California in 1996, and the way, I guess my first impression of grapes for winemaking is that I never tasted a tremendous difference between grapes of the same variety. They all kind of just tasted like wine grapes. Partly that was because we were tasting the grapes when they were probably too ripe. That was the way we were making wine back then. It was a trip to Burgundy with Raj. It was probably sacrilegious, but you used to be able to at least walk right into the vineyards. And so I remember walking the vineyards right before harvest and eating grapes from Malconsort and Latache, and I couldn't believe.
We won't tell anyone. You're on tape.
Couldn't believe how different the grapes tasted. And I was like, wow. So I started paying more attention to that before harvest, actually tasting grapes. And the grapes that grow underneath this tree taste very different than the grapes that grow away from the tree. And when you can taste that difference just in the fruit, there's going to be difference in the wine. What makes for that difference? I think it's a combination of the tree acts as a bit of a buffer to the wind that Matt was talking about, but also there's been a lot of work recently on just the symbiotic relationship between plants through the mycorrhizae. Tree is very old and it's very big, and so it pulls a lot of nutrients and micronutrients from the soil. We now know that we used to believe that exchange would be species specific, but now with more research we understand that it's actually different species share the nutrients through the mycorrhizae. And so those vines have a benefit nutritionally from being in that close proximity to that tree. And now we're doing more analysis in terms of taking petioles and measuring the actual those nutrients in those plants, and they have more nitrogen, more phosphorus, more potassium, more micronutrients. It's fascinating. So the tree acts as kind of like a stimulant in some ways, and it affects the vines.